how you like it, yeah.
What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the We Own TV podcast. My name is Leaf. I am your host. This is a podcast where we watch the first episode of a show and then talk about it. Today, we're talking about Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. Now, before we even get into the episode, Scott Pilgrim is my second favorite movie of all time. So naturally, when they said that they were doing this animated show on Netflix, I had, a lot of expectations going into it. I saw that they were bringing back the original cast for it, so I was like, okay, that's a big plus. But other than that, I didn't know what it was about, and if there was like trailers and stuff, I would just kind of like not look at it. I wanted to go in like fresh and just be like, okay, what are they gonna do? The movie again? Are they like, what are we getting into? Now, if you don't know what Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is, the summary on IMDb says a 20-something Toronto indie rocker's adventures in getting and keeping jobs, avoiding being kicked out of his apartment, and surviving encounters with the 7 evil exes of the new girl in town of whom he has a crush. Now, if you've seen the movie, right, before we even get into the show, if you've seen the movie, right, this thing says he's getting in and out of keeping jobs and avoiding being kicked out of his apartment. Even in this show, I was like, that's not true at all. If I were to rewrite this, I would be like a 20-something-year-old bum tries his best to gain the attention of a girl who has 7 evil exes, right? Like, boom. Because let's be honest, Scott is not the best person in either iteration. But that's a whole nother tirade I can save for the end of this episode. Let's just hop right into the episode. So we get the intro. It is a lot like the movie. I'm going to make a lot of references to the movie because, again, it's one of my favorites. It is a lot like the movie. The art style is already amazing off the bat. I like that we're kind of seeing possible scenes from the future and just kind of like clips of people like hanging out with each other. And you're kind of like, oh, okay. Some of the small little vignettes feel like this world has been lived in for a little while, or like we might see things and we might not see in the episode. So that was kind of cool. We start off with Scott in the desert, and he's like, oh, I'm so alone. And he looks like the sun is beating down on him. And that's when we get our first introduction into Ramona. And she's like, yo, it's time to wake up, my guy. And this is, again, very much just like the movie. Scott wakes up. This is where we get our first introduction of Wallace. And then we also get what will be the running thing throughout the show of the little text on the side being like, this is Wallace. He's insert age. He's Scott's roommate, stuff like that. Just a little information to get you in. And Wallace is like, Scott, when are you going to get your own place and stop using my stuff? And then Scott starts feeling some type of way. And already off the bat, I was like, okay, this is a little bit different because in the movie, it's not really like it's a small joke and it's just kind of like whatever. But like in here, Wallace is really like, hey, man, I'll let you bum here once. Like, when are you going to get your shit together? And then it does the same thing where it shows all the stuff in the apartment. And everything's pretty much just Wallace's, and Scott has like almost nothing. And then Wallace is making a cup of coffee. Scott's like, yo, can you make me some? And Wallace is like, no. And then Scott drinks his coffee anyways and then dips. He's like, all right, see you later, bro. It's like, oh, this kid's the worst. So then it goes over to Steven's house because they're practicing in the band Sex Bomb. This is where we get the little vignette or the little, titles of we meet Steven, we meet Kim, we meet Knives, we meet young Neil. They start playing their song. It's not the song from any of the songs from the movie. So I was like, oh, cool, a brand new song, but it still has the same vibe, which is awesome. Knives is geeking out. She's like, you guys are the best band that's ever happened. And then Kim's like, I don't know about that. Then, we kind of cut to they're heading over to Julie's party. They're like, oh, how's it feel to have like Knives be your girlfriend? And Scott's like, no, she's not my girlfriend. Like, she is, but not really. And Kim makes a sarcastic joke like, oh, your life is so interesting. And then Scott's like, oh, thanks. And he's like, wait, that's sarcasm. But like in the movie, Scott is very much like, I live in my world and you guys kind of revolve around me. Like, he's almost like a deer in headlights. He's just like nothing really phases him for the most part. Where in this, Wallace makes the reference of like, hey, man, you should get your own place. And like Kim makes a sarcastic joke. It seems that this Scott is a little more aware of what's going on, which is kind of nice because, again, it feels already, and this is just probably like the first 5 minutes into it, it feels the same as the movie, but a little more realistic. and just different enough that it's like, this is already brand new. So as soon as they get to the party, everyone dips, which is funny because I feel like in the movie it's the other way around. Like you have to like go to find Scott, but in here they're just like up and leave him, which is kind of funny. And then Scott sees Ramona, and instead of the Pac-Man story, he tells her a Sonic story about that animated cartoons. And she's actually like into it in the movie. She's like, okay, like, why are you talking to me? But she's like, oh, no, I didn't actually watch those cartoons. So that's kind of interesting. And then, of course, Scott goes, hey, are you real? And she's like, what? And he's like, I'll leave you alone now. And it's just, very endearing of anytime you're trying to flirt with someone and then you just say something dumb like, yo, do you breathe air? And you're like, oh my God, why the fuck did I say that? But this is where Scott runs into Julie. Julie still doesn't like him, even in this version. But she like unintentionally gives him the rundown on Ramona of like, oh yeah, she's from New York. She's this guy named Gideon, yada, yada, yada. And then she's like, I forbid you from like dating her. It's like, well, why did you tell him all this information? In that whole, lore dump of Ramona, it turns out that she delivers DVDs for Netflix, which is funny for two reasons. One, this is on Netflix, so of course it's, has to be tied to Netflix in some way. But the other thing is, if you are old enough, then you know that Netflix used to actually like not sell, but like you would rent DVDs through Netflix. This was like how they started. My dad was one of, like, when it first came out, he was like, yo, I promise this is going to change the game. Turns out it was right. But yeah, before they started streaming, they used to do DVDs like Blockbuster. And if you don't know what Blockbuster is, you're too young. Don't worry about it. But yeah, so a lot of people will kind of forget that was even how they started. But yeah, so Scott goes home, he orders a DVD. He's sitting there waiting for it. Wallace is like, yo, it's going to take some time. You can't it's not going to pop up tomorrow. Eventually, Ramona gets there and she recognizes him. She's like, yo, Sonic guy. And then in the movie, he was like, no, the whole joke, that was someone else. But here he's like, yep, that's me. And she's like, your name is Wallace? And he's like, no, that's my roommate. I'm like, using his credit card because I can't rent from DVD stores anymore or whatever. And she's like, oh, so he's your sugar daddy. And he's like, what? Which is so funny. I feel like anyone else would probably think the same situation. Like, oh, Wallace is like paying for Scott's bills. It's kind of funny because it's not true because Scott's just being a bum. But anyways, moving on. This is where we get to that subspace highway that she was talking about. Like, oh yeah, I like travel through your head because it's like faster to like get around, which I didn't understand in the movie and I don't really understand here. I've never read the graphic novel, so I'm sure there's an explanation for it, but I'm just kind of like, just like Scott, I'm like, all right, cool, whatever you say. And then this is where he asks her on a date. Now, they go on the subsequent date. It is very similar to the movie. There's not really much difference. There's kind of like talking. Scott makes an X-Men joke. She doesn't get it. And then he like has a face. It's like, what? You don't understand X-Men? Which is very much a thing I probably would have done in my youth because, I always assume everyone's as nerdy as me. So when I made references, people around me would just be like, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm like, what? You don't read comic books? And yeah, they're just kind of like doing the generic talking. Again, it's very similar to the movie. And then this is where things get different. And we realize that Gideon is actually like somehow recording them. And he's like, all right, it's time to bring the league together. Apparently he's been doing this from the start and just kind of like watching Ramona for who knows how long. Who's to say? And it starts snowing really hard. Ramona's like, yo, let me travel through the store. Again, she has some sort of powers I don't understand. They go back to her house. Again, pretty much the same thing from the movie. I do miss the joke in the movie. She like names like 10 different teas. And he's like, did you make some of those up? He's cold. She goes to get a blanket. She's taking too long. He goes to check on her. She's getting dressed. They get really close. They kiss. There's actual sparks between them, which they can see. Because again, this world is like a video game. And they get in bed together. And I feel like this part is different where she's on top of him and Scott's like, actually, I don't think I'm ready to like do anything. And she's like, cool, I changed my mind about doing anything with you in general. But from what I remember in the movie, she's the one that's like, hey, I don't want to do this. I changed my mind. And he's like, oh, okay, that's cool. I think I just needed to like, just be with someone without really having sex or anything like that. So again, this show is very similar to the movie, but just different enough that, and realistic enough that I feel like you get to know the characters in a slightly different way. We then cut to Matthew Patel meeting up with Gideon, and it turns out that Gideon, this show is way more into like Gideon being like a CEO as opposed to the movie where it's like, yeah, he's kind of what am I trying to say? In the movie, he is rich, but he feels more like a celebrity than a CEO. And then already in this first episode, I feel like he's more like a CEO than a celebrity because he's organizing everything. And then he's like, yeah, my interns go out and like look up Scott, and turns out, he doesn't have any job. He's like bumming at his friend's place. He's dating a high schooler, and Ramona doesn't know about it. And the interesting part is Matthew's like, hey, do I need to really know anything? Like, how good is he at fighting? Gideon's like, Scott is apparently one of the best fighters in the area, which makes more sense when you think about him like fighting in the movie. But in the movie, it's just like, oh, he happens to be good at fighting. Whereas this, it's like, no, it's a known quantity that like Scott can really brawl when it comes down to it, which is kind of like, oh, okay, interesting. The next day, Scott invites Ramona to their band show. Ramona's like, yo, you gotta go. I gotta go to work. But yeah, before he leaves, he invites her to the show. Scott goes home. Of course, he's walking on sunshine. He tells Wallace about Ramona, and he's like, great, cool, you got to break up with Knives. And he's like, oh, why do I have to? And it's like, Scott, come on, my guy. And of course, Wallace is like, listen, that girl is a sweet angel. She thinks you two are dating. You have to break it off. And then that's where he finds that he has a letter from the League, which I thought was interesting to do a letter, especially now in these days, because I'm like, who really sends out letters? Like in the movie, it was an email. I don't know why it wouldn't be the same thing, like just do an email again. But anyways, yeah, he gets the letter, same thing where he's reading it and he's like, this is boring, and he throws it away. We then cut to the Rocket. This is where the band's going to play. Knives gets to meet Scott's sister. And of course, there's a small joke where she's like, yo, you're so much better than him. And she's like, better than who? And it's like, Knives, read the room. But she's young. Scott sees Knives. He makes a face almost as if he forgot that she was there, and he's like, oh snap. And then he sees Ramona, and then he just runs away, and it's like, oh, okay, still a little different from the movie in some areas, but in this part still the same. And then it turns out there's no Crashing the Boys, which is one of the small jokes I loved about the movie, of like the first song being like 2 seconds long, and then the second one being like really long about Wallace. And then there's no guy for like Wallace to make, it's just different. I feel like I like the movie version of this scene more than I like the show. But yeah, Crashing the Boys dropped out. Steven is freaking out because he's like, what if they dropped out because we suck? And then Kim's like, maybe we do suck. And he's like, why would you say that, Kim? But, Scott's looking out. He's like, oh my God, they're going to talk to each other. And then right before Ramona and Knives can really talk to each other, because they start talking about like, oh, we're both dating someone in the band. And then Julie's like, who are you dating in the band, Ramona? And that's when they go out and they start playing. And again, it's the song from the beginning of the episode, which is none of the songs from the movie, but again, still good. Still feels like Sex Bomb. This is where Matthew shows up, and he's like, you do the whole thing of like, hey, I'm here to fight you. And he's like, wait, why are you here? I'm one of Ramona's exes. We've all, decided to like make sure like to control her love life. And then Scott's like, oh, I didn't really read the letter that she sent me. Yada, yada. Eventually, they're like, okay, we got to fight. Oh, and Knives is passed out when they started playing, which is why she's not aware of anything that's going on. So they start having the fight. They say he got mystical powers, but he's not really using them, unlike in the movie where he like summons his little demon girls and he starts doing like a whole Bollywood type thing. They're just kind of like doing the beginning part of the fight. And then, boom, Scott's dead. And it's like, what the fuck? And then even the announcer is like, KO, question mark? And, they drop the little change that like a video game when it happens. And Scott is dead. And then the episode just cuts the credits. And it's just like, oh, this is not the movie. You know what I mean? Like, this is not the movie. Scott is dead. Where are we going? Is this going to be Ramona's story? Like, holy shit. So yeah, so I want to get into spoilers because I watched the entire season. But if you're new here, I have a 3-point rating system for all the shows I watch. It is one and done. Give it a chance, and I'm in. For this one, I mean, I was already biased going in, which could have been either way, but I'm giving it 100% I'm in. It still has the humor of the movie that I love. And again, some of the smaller things, which is what I liked about the movie, is the small things. Some of the smaller things of Scott being a little more aware of things that are going on, and everyone's a little bit the same, but sometimes they're a little bit different and they just feel a slight bit more realistic, is what really drew me into this episode. And then of course having Scott die at the end of this episode is like, cool, is this gonna be Ramona? Like, what the hell is going on here? So 100% I'm in. I'm gonna watch the next episode, and again, like I said, spoilers ahead, I already watched the entire season. I binged it in like a day. I am going to get into spoilers. If this is where you're going to drop out, I appreciate it. Come back after you've watched the series, and then we can get into spoilers, or you can listen to me talk about spoilers. If not, I appreciate your time. I'll see you next time. If you're going to stay for spoilers, get ready in 3, 2. All right, so one of the things I really loved about this show is that it was more of Ramona's story. It is her kind of dealing with the fact of like, why am I so interested in like finding this guy? But it's like, oh no, I feel like I've actually had a connection for once with like literally seeing sparks from the moment we kissed. But I think what really excels in this show is her coming to terms of like, hey, you've messed with all of these people in their lives, and sure, maybe some of them are holding on for too long, but you've messed with people in these lives and you're affecting them and you're not really thinking about it. And I think the best representation of this is Roxy, X number 4, because in the movie they don't really say anything about her. She dies from like an orgasm. It's so stupid. It's one of the parts I don't like about this movie. But in the show, you know, you get to see it from her perspective of like, hey, we were a thing and you literally just like up and dipped one day, to the point where she kind of gives her like the peace sign and just like walks away. And she's like, you know, I'm a human too. Like, you could have just talked to me about it or whatever. Like, even if it wasn't working, you just kind of threw me away. Like, what the fuck? And, you know, they fight it out, but eventually she's like, I'm sorry. What I did to you was wrong. I should have just talked to you. You know, all that good stuff. And then they make up and she's like, all right, well, I guess, you know, that's something I needed to hear. And Roxy kind of gets closure. And again, it's where I'm like, oh, okay, the show can really explore more of these characters without Scott being the center of the whole thing. And now we can get deeper. But at the same time, one of the biggest problems I had with the series was that for the things that we dipped deeper into, there were other things that I thought we were going to dip into that we didn't. Best example I can give is the Katyanagi twins. In the movie, they, you know, they make a reference of like a joke about like, oh, maybe she dated them at the same time. But they don't talk. They have like cool powers, but they die in that music battle. And in this one, it's like, okay, no, she was dating them both at the same time, and they both built a robot, so they're really smart. But like, we didn't get to learn about them anymore. Like, I don't have any idea of who they really are. All we found out was that, oh no, they're cool with Scott, and in the future they make their own band and like make YouTube videos, which is cool. But it was like, no, this is your chance to like redeem them, because the last couple X's, so 4 and the Katyanagi twins, got like no love in the movie, or like no real backstory or anything. And then it's like, cool, you gave 4 such a deep, you know, kind of rewrite of like having us understand who she is. And then the other 2, you just kind of like, oh no, they're still there. And it's like, well, what was the point? Like, I wanted you to expand more on this thing that I love, and you kind of dropped the ball on one end, but then you nailed it on the other end. And also, like, just with the other characters, because Scott isn't around, you know, it's you know, on one hand, you got Julie, and we're seeing like her almost like rise to like evilness, and then you know, her whole thing with like Gideon, whose real name is Goose, or he like goes by Goose or whatever. It's like, oh, okay, this is interesting. And then on the other hand, it's like, okay, cool. In the movie, the band was better without Scott in the end. But like in this one, we don't really explore the band at all. Knives joins at the end, but like the whole in between, they're like writing for the play. But what I expected, and maybe this is all just my expectations, was that the band was gonna do really well without selling to a label, almost like be a really good independent artist, and it'd be like, oh, this is what happens when Scott's not around. Like everything's kind of like better when, you know, everything isn't revolved around this guy who's just kind of like crashing through people's lives. But sometimes, you know, the show did explore that, I felt like, and sometimes the show didn't. And I was like, there's no, I mean, again, you can't really, you know, please everyone. But yeah, I just felt like my overall spoiler thoughts were just like, sometimes we got more and that's awesome, and then sometimes we didn't, and I was like, but guys, it's right there. But I like that in the end, you know, older Ramona talking to Ramona, I mean, the two of them fusing was kind of like, what? But just her kind of being like, hey, don't forget, like, you keep leaving people and you need to start loving yourself a little more, and then you can start loving others. I like that Scott was seeing future versions of himself where he's just like losing his mind essentially, and like not really talking to Ramona about how he feels or anything. And he's like, hey man, if you just do like these small things, like maybe you wouldn't be here. And older Scott's like, nah, dude. And it's funny because it's, you know, you look at any drama show and it's like, yo, if you guys talk to each other for like 5 minutes, your problems would probably fade away. Having Scott kind of be, you know, in our shoes of being like, hey, maybe I don't be like you if I just talk to my wife. And him being like, no, that's not how you, that's no. What's awesome. I love the art style of this whole thing. Again, there are parts of this show that I liked more from the movie simply because, again, we were able to dive deeper into some of these characters and also just get a different experience of what their lives might be like if Scott wasn't around. I love the meta joke of Scott's fabulous, or Scott's small, I forget what it's called, but the movie that they were trying to make, it's the same name as the first episode, It's a Wonderful Life or something like that, is essentially the movie but in their universe. Like, oh, this is like if we wrote a movie about Scott, it would be the movie that we know in real life. I was like, okay, that's cool. Little nod to, you know, the fans. I could keep talking about this forever, but I wouldn't say that I fell in love with the series, but I like the series enough that if I were to show someone the movie and they've never seen it, I'd be like, we have to watch the show right after. Like, it's required viewership. Like, we have to watch it too. But unfortunately, I don't think I love the show enough to be like, oh yeah, I'm definitely gonna put this in like a pantheon of like one of my favorite things. Like, it just doesn't hit me the same way, and I think it's maybe just because I love the movie so much that the lack of jokes and some of the storylines, like, you know, Knife's story in the movie compared to the show is like totally different. I feel like we actually got more of her in the movie. Stuff like that is kind of like, I don't think this hits in my heart the way that I was hoping it would. But yeah, I'd still, if they put out another season, I'd 100% watch it. So I don't know what all that information means to you guys, but hopefully you enjoyed listening to me ramble about this. If you follow me on Twitter or X at Little Leafers, definitely shoot me some messages. We could talk about it. Give this show a rating from wherever you hear it. I appreciate your time. For now, I'm just going to upload every week. I haven't been consistent and I'm tired of being like, oh, I promise I'll get it next time. So I will upload every week. I can do that for sure. And then hopefully I'll get on a schedule of every Tuesday. But until then, I will see you guys next week. All right. Peace.